Look at this, folks. We have Robert Scott. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs here for the U.S. Thanks for being with us, Robert. Look, this is a continent of more than 1 billion people stretching over both hemispheres, all the major religions, and many different interests. What are the administration's goals, then, for this conference?
No, thank you, Errol and Lana, for having me on. The goals are to continue with our engagement policy. President Biden, and one of his first acts in office was to send a congratulatory message to the assembled African leaders at the African Union annual meeting. That was followed up by travel by Secretary Blinken to the continent and the launch of the U.S. Africa strategy. So this is the continuation of that ongoing process, having 49 delegations here in order to talk through the most important issues that are facing our globe. Climate change, health, food security, and the ongoing strong ties that we've had for decades between the United States and the countries and peoples of Africa.
Well, speaking of those strong ties, China and Russia have both had really concerted efforts as of late, strategically trying to bolster their own ties with the African continent, sometimes at expense to the United States. Is the administration at all concerned about some of those relationships?
No, I think we have our own decades-long relationships. I recently served as the U.S. ambassador to Malawi, and we celebrated the arrival of Peace Corps volunteers in the early 1960s. And that is true across the continent. We've had embassies, we've had businesses, we've got American tourists tend to be the #1 visitors to many of the countries on the continent. So our relationship on the continent is broad, it's deep, it goes back for decades, and we continue to strengthen it. Now, the people and governments of Africa obviously have choices, and we're not stopping anybody from engaging with anybody else, but we are pushing forward a very strong set of policies and priorities. Just right now, we've had a very successful a set of business meetings that are ongoing. I just witnessed a $150 million deal that was signed, which was incredibly important as far as mining goes on the continent. So our relationships stand on their own.
Yeah, but on that note, do you feel like the United States does enough for Africa?
Oh, absolutely. If you take a look at the statistics, we are the #1 supplier of, let's say, humanitarian aid, but also of investments into areas that are incredibly important. If you take a look at PEPFAR, which is the HIV program on the continent, over the last decade plus, we, together with our African partners, saved tens of millions of lives. And that assisted us in addressing the COVID challenge. And so the work that we did in strengthening systems and strengthening healthcare systems on the continent for our PEPFAR work, in fact, allowed us to work with our partners to address the challenges of COVID. So we see ourselves as being well placed as partners on the continent.
And one of the biggest challenges we all face in the future here is the climate change and the impact it has on agriculture and migration. What does the U.S. want its relationship to be with some African nations which may not have the resources the rest of the world needs, but has people who will be suffering, bearing the brunt of climate change, despite the fact they're not the contributors like the U.S. and China is to the issue?
Right. If you take a look at the full 3-day arc of the event here, it underlines that we share those concerns and our engagement with our partners. The first day of the summit, which was yesterday, we had a highly successful forum on climate change, on climate equity and justice, on environmental programming, and on climate specifically. That allowed a number of heads of state to meet with senior officials from the United States, with NGOs, with researchers, with think tanks to talk through these issues. And we are going to culminate the 3 days tomorrow with the Leaders' Day, in which President Biden will host all the heads of state to a series of meetings. And the final meeting tomorrow will be on food security, underlining how incredibly important it is to be able to produce food in a time when climate is changing, and how do we do that most effectively? Those will be the things that will be discussed tomorrow in the last event, underlining its importance.
And there's so much to protect. Robert, spending time in Malawi, you'll know the Chua people. I had the privilege of experiencing that culture and absorbing it for a previous assignment. We appreciate you speaking us through what the U.S. plans to do in the future. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.